For the longest time, creators have been hiding special messages within their work. In more recent times, these have become known as Easter eggs, and they have often been put in place to serve as something of a reward for those who want to look a little deeper, but also to give bodies of work a more personal connection with the creators themselves. For example, Pixar are well known for including A113 throughout many of their works as a reference to a classroom at CalArts that notable employees like John Lasseter and Brad Bird frequented during their studies. Due to the interactive nature of video games, Easter eggs have often taken on a more hands-on role within that specific medium, but the more static references, tributes and homages do still exist in their droves, and Final Fantasy is no exception here. Final Fantasy I, for example, had the classic reference to The Legend of Zelda, and in more recent times, Final Fantasy XV featured vast quantities of references to internal properties like Crisis Core and external ones like this nice line from Back to the Future.
Where we're going, we don't need roads.
These references were often unexpected, giving us the warm and fuzzies, but they weren't all that crazy, as they just, well, existed. There was nothing the player had to do to find them outside of just looking in the right direction or interacting with the right object. The ones that were a bit more crazy needed that extra layer of interaction and dedication. They required the player to be inquisitive, pushing and playing the games in unconventional ways. By proxy, this meant they were much harder to find, but when activated, that warm and fuzzy feeling was just amplified even more. And it's something that is particularly apparent with an Easter egg in Final Fantasy VII, which related to another game released by Square around the same time called Xenogears. And there's actually quite a bit of backstory around why this Easter egg exists. When Final Fantasy VII was in its earlier stages of development, numerous script concepts were proposed. One was written by Hironobu Sakaguchi that would see the game's protagonists being pursued by a detective named Joe, and another was written by the husband and wife duo of Tetsuya Takahashi and Kiyoru Tanaka. Within the final product, elements of Sakaguchi's script were still incorporated, but the script penned by Takahashi and Tanaka was deemed too dark and complicated to be considered fantasy by the higher-ups, and they decided to use it for a new project instead. With Takahashi then installed as the game's director, this new project began in earnest as Project Noah, and the original plan at least was that it would act as a sequel to Chrono Trigger. When it became clear that this just wasn't working, Project Noah was instead changed to become a standalone project called Xenogears. And that's where our Easter egg comes in, as perhaps due to the early connection that was shared between Final Fantasy VII and Xenogears, there's a pretty well hidden nod to Xenogears featured within Final Fantasy VII. It's accessible when Cloud is wheelchair bound after recovering from falling into the livestream in Medial. During this time you're able to talk to him, but what you get in way of response is just gibberish. Or is it? As if you continue talking to Cloud within the original version of the game, he will start to say, "A billion mirror fragments, small, light, taken, angels, singing voices, Xenogears." At the time of the PlayStation release, this meant absolutely nothing. But a year later, when Xenogears released on the PlayStation, it became clear that Cloud was being rather prophetic. He was reciting lyrics from Small 2 of Pieces, the vocal theme of Xenogears. This was pretty cool in itself, but it was also rather unique, as it essentially acted as an homage to the future. What's even more interesting about this Easter egg is that the English localization team were not kept in the loop about its inclusion, and just translated the Japanese words as best they could with the knowledge they had. It's why within the original game, the Japanese version featured Cloud's last line as Xenogears, while the English version was translated to Xenogears. This was then addressed within the Xenogears official strategy guide, as they attempted to try and dispel any confusion, and to do this they recommended that players try to pronounce it phonetically to make Xenogears should the Easter egg be stumbled upon. This was then fixed within later English releases to say Xenogears instead, which was a nice touch. As a bonus Easter egg, the Xenogears team repaid the favour by including a poster of Tifa Lockhart within their game. And on the subject of Tifa Lockhart, Final Fantasy VIII featured a few allusions to her character, with Zell having Dolphin Blow and Final Heaven within his dual ability. But in terms of Easter eggs, well, the development team decided to have a bit of fun. The usage of dance moves from Michael Jackson's Thriller music video during Edea's parade in Deling City is pretty common knowledge. But what's less known is that the developers weren't satisfied with that and decided to include another Easter egg that was a bit more hidden. It can be initiated when the party splits up to try and save Garden from the impending missile strike. When in control of the team who are at the Galbadian missile base, you have to use a computer terminal to try and reconfigure the missiles. On this terminal, there are quite a few different options, but one of them allows you to see information about the various equipment and personnel involved in the missile strike. You can view the Galbadian Army missile launcher, and when looking at the cruise missiles, there's some serious dialogue from the characters relating to how the group can lower the accuracy of the missiles. That serious tone, though, can be removed when viewing information on the Galbadian soldier and elite soldier, as by holding down triangle and square and then pressing up or down on the D-pad, you could make the renders bust out some funky dance moves. This then prompted some much less serious dialogue and was bound to generate some chuckles from any gamers who managed to activate this particular Easter egg. Now, on the whole, Final Fantasy XIII was a pretty serious game, and the narrative left little room for joking around and goofing off. It made the implementation of Easter eggs a bit restrictive, but that didn't stop the developers from having a bit of fun at the expense of gamers who were just pushing things a bit too far. I think we've all heard of idle animations, like Sonic's famous foot tapping and Mario taking a nap, but within Final Fantasy XIII, they did the opposite, including specific animations if players instead moved around too much. This Easter egg can be activated when using any character, and it's done so by wiggling the analog stick around in an excessive manner. If done correctly, then the player will stop and act a bit exasperated. Each character had a different animation, with Saz's perhaps coming across as the most apt. With Final Fantasy IX acting as a love letter to everything that came before, it's probably not too surprising to learn that it features an Easter egg or two, and one rather subtle Easter egg is quite similar to the first Easter egg on this list in terms of how it's activated. It can be initiated right at the start of the game, when Baku is running through the plan to kidnap Princess Garnet. To make sure that Zidane is paying attention, he will ask who they're supposed to kidnap. You are of course meant to select Princess Garnet, and doing so allows the story to progress. But if you don't, Baku will get a bit confused, saying the wrong name in his speech before then realizing and scolding Zidane. It's meant to be comical, and it is, but what's interesting about this particular sequence is that you can continue to give the wrong answer again and again and again. After repeating this action 64 times, Ruby will eventually storm into the room and yell at Zidane for his stubbornness. Later on in Final Fantasy IX, there's also another pretty cool Easter egg that focused around the Trino Auction House, the Black Mage Village, and the original Final Fantasy III. The Trino Auction House contained many rare items, including key items that can be resold to various upstanding citizens of Trino, collectibles like Mini-Cid, and equipable items like the anklet and ribbon. There are two though which make reference to Final Fantasy III, Doga's artifact and Une's mirror. These key items appear as a reference to Doga and Unai, who were supporting characters in Final Fantasy III that joined as guests during subsegments and were later fought as bosses. Upon purchasing these items, you could resell them for profit, but if you instead chose to head to the Black Mage Village Inn and then examine the music player, the background music would change to an arranged version of Let Me Know the Truth, a piece of music that was originally composed by Nobuo Uematsu for Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy XIV has a ridiculous amount of pop culture references and homages to the games that came before. It's one of the things that makes the game so great, as outside of being a fantastic experience, it's just one big huge nostalgia trip. And to show the level of dedication the developers have towards this particular aspect of the game, we'd like to focus your attentions on one Easter egg that relates to the original Final Fantasy. As we covered in our recent video on minigames, the original Final Fantasy and subsequent remakes had hidden within a version of the classic 15 puzzle. It wasn't the most intuitive of games to access, as in the original, you had to hold down the A button while pressing the B button 55 times, all while your party was travelling aboard the ship. But it was still a fun little distraction where you could even win prizes if you could complete the puzzle quickly enough. Perhaps due to feelings of reverence, the developers decided that they wanted to include this within Final Fantasy XIV, and they did so during the Rising 2014 edition. This was a celebratory event that now takes place on the anniversary of the launch of Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, and it's a huge deal. Square Enix often releases unique artwork, they conduct the Eorzean census, release new story content, and also unveil a host of event quests and collaborations. In 2014, for example, there are crossovers related to Dragon Quest X, Final Fantasy XI, and Lightning Returns. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus our attention on one specific event quest in particular that was called What Blooms in the Night. For this quest, you had to assist Bran the Gazetteer to track down an elusive individual, and if you were successful, you would get some experience, some gil, the Huzzah emote, an achievement, and a miscellaneous reward called the Slide 114 minigame, which was accessible within the toy chest. This was cool in itself, but the Easter egg was that the minigame would have its appearance changed at random to look like the original Final Fantasy I version. But it didn't stop there, as the developers also implemented a rule that meant on the 18th of December, it would always look like the original Final Fantasy I version, something that acted as a nice nod to its Japanese release date. For our final Easter egg, we're going to look at one that has continued to appear in various versions of Final Fantasy IV, and it's a bit different from the other 6, as it required players to go off the beaten path and explore a little. Within the PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, and PSP versions of the game, there's a hidden wall within the pub in the Dwarven Castle, and it can be identified by a cracked floor tile. This led to a secret passage which allowed players to gain access to the developer's office or developer's room. Hidden within, you could find prominent members of the development team such as Hironobu Sakaguchi, who appeared as a red chocobo, Nobuo Uematsu, who appeared inside the music room, and Hiroyuki Ito, who you could fight in a random encounter. Bringing things back to our original Easter egg, Tetsuya Takahashi also appeared as a random encounter, as before penning the script of Xenogears and then acting as the game's director, he worked as a battle graphics artist on Final Fantasy IV and on field graphics for other Square titles. The other notorious part of this Easter egg related to the acquisition of a magazine, which, when used as an item, would cause the screen to go pink, dancing Calcabrina to play as the background music, and Cecil to declare, "Now this is what I call great literature." This Easter egg also featured within the DS version and could be accessed in the exact same way. It was kept pretty faithful to the original too, with an almost identical floor plan. There were some notable differences though. For example, the staff members were updated to instead relate to the DS remake as opposed to the original game, and fights were made much more comprehensive, with one seeing you square off against the game's producer, Tomoyo Asano. Unique versions of the developer's office Easter egg also appeared in Final Fantasy IV Interlude, where it was populated by staff who worked on Final Fantasy IV The Complete Collection, and in Final Fantasy IV The After Years, where it had been relocated to the True Moon. Final Fantasy XIV, the King of Easter Eggs, also featured its own version of the developer's room during the 2015 Rising event, where it was called the 18th Floor, and inside, players could meet Naoki Yoshida. But that wasn't all, as another version appeared within Final Fantasy Dimensions, and it meant that what started as a pretty nice little feature had ended up spawning into something much greater. And with that, it feels like a good place to wrap this up. We really hope you've enjoyed learning about some of the pretty crazy Easter eggs that have appeared throughout the years in Final Fantasy games. If you did, then please do consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. We would also love to hear if there are any other Easter eggs you've got a kick out of that appear within the same criteria that we've used for this video. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you as always to our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and a big thank you to everyone who watched this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.